Welcome to this talk about building a Christmas gift service using GraphQL and .NET 8. I'm Johan Smarius and I'm an educator and software developer specializing in .NET. But that's enough about me. What are we going to build? Santa wants to get rid of his old book and move into the digital age. He asked us to build a backend service for this. We could of course use a RESTful approach, but since Santa has specific demands about scalability, we are going to build this service using GraphQL. But what are we going to use to build this service? For a starting point, I want to start using the Web API template provided with .NET 8. And don't worry, we're not going to build the Web API and then move it over to GraphQL. I simply want to use the code that is generated by the Web API as a starting point for our own work. And to keep things simple, we are not going to use authentication for this demo. Of course, in the real life scenario, you wouldn't be able to do it without, but simply to keep this video on an acceptable length, let's skip the authentication part. So when we hit the create button, code gets generated for us. Okay. Let's take a look at the code that got generated. Only one program CS file is generated, the other ones are simply app settings. So if we look into this file, you may notice there's a lot of middleware stuff, and apparently the template used a minimal API to start building some default code. Well, I'm not interested in the default code, so I'm going to throw this one away. I'm going to throw away the record. So now we have a clean starting point to build our own custom code. But if we do want to build a GraphQL service, what can we use? Well, unfortunately, there's no native support within the .NET framework to build GraphQL services. So you may think that you have to build a lot of code yourself. Well, that could be, but there are some very good NuGet packages that you can use for building a GraphQL service with an acceptable number of lines of your own code. Well, there are a number of options, and for this talk I am going to use Hot Chocolate, not because it's per se the best GraphQL service implementation, but it's one that really integrates very well with ASP.NET Core, but also with Entity Framework Core, and that's what I want to use for this talk. Before I can start writing some code, I do have to add some NuGet packages. I want to use Entity Framework Core for the backend service for the database interaction, so I'm going to look up the NuGet packages available. Well, let's start using Entity Framework Core as one. Okay, run install, and I do want to use the tools as well. Well, let's add that one, and now I have to make a choice. I'm running on a Mac, and SQL Server is not supported very well on a Mac, so I'm going to use SQLite for my actual database engine. Okay, that will mean that I've got all the NuGet packages I need for Entity Framework Core. Now let's start looking at what I do need for Hot Chocolate. And you can actually see some packages coming up, so I am going to use Hot Chocolate. That's the one I'm going to install, but that's not the only one. If I scroll a bit down, you will see that I do have ASP.NET Core integration. Well, let's install that one. And I do have a package specifically around data, and of course data for Entity Framework. So now I do I need a lot more? No, that's probably enough to get started. And if we look at the packages that we now included, it's Hot Chocolate ASP.NET Core, Data, and Data Entity Framework, and also all the default packages that you normally need for Entity Framework Core. Well, that's a good starting point, and let's start building our service from this point onwards. When I start building a service, I always liked starting with the domain specification first. So let's create a folder called models, and let's start adding some classes for our domain to this folder. Well, probably the first class that comes in mind is of course the child class, and I have created the code beforehand so that I don't have to type in everything, so I will simply copy and paste it from the generated code. And what I came up with for the child is an ID, because I do want to store it in the database. Every child has a name, it contains a list of gifts, and a child belongs to a family. Well, of course, we're not there yet, so let's first go for family and copy in the code for the family as well. Let's copy it, because what you will see is that a family has an ID as well. A family has a name, it has a collection of children, and it has a reference to address. Well, let's start with creating the address class, and it's not that difficult because I do keep things simple. We simply have a street name, a city, and a house number. So a lot of the difficulties around this domain are left out of this demo. Okay. One thing that I do need to add, of course, is the gift. Because children would like to get gifts. So let's add a gift class, and let's copy in the gift code that I have on a different screen. And what I do have is the ID, the name of the gift, the description, with a reference back to the child. Well, if I have done my work correctly, then if I build this, I will get a successful build with warnings because I didn't pay attention to nullability. Now that the domain is in place, it's time to start adding some GraphQL specific code to this service. And you do have to know a little bit about how GraphQL works to get started. Well, a service, at least getting data from a service, revolves around specifying a query. Well, that's the first thing that we are going to do. We are going to add a query class to our service to make sure that the data can be retrieved. So I will start adding a directory around GraphQL. And within that directory, I am going to create a class, a regular class, and we do have to start writing a query. But we have to come up with a decent name for the query, at least a starting point for the navigation. So if we think about it, and especially for a gift service, what would be a very good starting point? Of course, I could start with a child. That would be a very good starting point, but in a family, there are a number of children most of the time. So I do choose for this demo not to use a child as a starting point for the query, but a family as a starting point for the query. So I'm going to create a family query class within my code. And I don't have to derive this class from any specific. I can simply write the code here, and I have to hook it up with GraphQL, with Hot Chocolate, at a later time. So what would be a good method to add to this query? Well, I came up with one, and that's probably an IEnumerable that will return the family, and where it says get all children. And you will see it generated some extra information for us, or at least a hint for it, but I'm not going to use that just yet. And all I have to do is, of course, add a reference to the family. Family is not known yet. The family is not known yet, probably because to move console, probably, no, that's public. Let's see, why didn't it correctly? It's in models. Let's add simply to the model using models. Okay, that will fix this. And simply throw here new not implemented exception, because I do have to add some code here. I do want to get the children from our database. Of course, I could use in a memory list, but since this has all got to do with integration with Entity Framework Core as well, I do want to start using Entity Framework Core from the beginning. But in order to do that, I of course do need a DB context, so let's add this one first. Hot Chocolate doesn't put any demands on the context that I use, so let's first create a directory and let's call that directory database, and let's create a new class in it, and let's create the gift context class. Of course, it has to derive from our DB context, and I do have to add some code to it. And what I will do is add a constructor with the options for the DB context, and of course there is some information about the DB sets that I want to include. So the child, the family, and the gift. Okay, that's the basic for our DB context. And in order to be able to actually test our code, I do want to start adding some default data to our DB context. So what I will do is I will add an onModel creating method, and it simply does nothing but simply provide some default data for the different classes. Okay, and let's see if I didn't make any mistakes. So let's build this solution together, and we have still got the build succeeded. We do have to hook up this context, of course, to our middleware. So let's go to Program CS and let's start adding some information. Well, let's start adding our DB context, and I'm going to use a pooled DB context factory because Hot Chocolate can use different contexts at the same time, parallel contexts, and it's easy to have a pooled DB context for that. And since I use SQLite, I'm only specifying a data source, and for you to be able to see what kind of queries that are fired, I did enable sensitive data logging and I added logging. Please do not enable sensitive data logging in your own production code. It's simply for the demo purpose here. Before I can start using this context, I of course have to run some migrations. So what I will do is I will use a plugin. I will add a migration initial, put it in the default build configuration. Great. And let's generate a migration. And of course, not only should I generate a migration, but I should update the database as well. So let's update the database, and if everything is correct, you will see that there's a gifts DB generated within my Solution Explorer. Well, great. Now I've got my database in place. Now I can start working on my query once again. So let's get back to our GraphQL folder and go to the family query, and I'm going to replace the code that I just wrote with some different code. Well, I'm going to say, well, I'm having the same method syntax, but I do inject the gift context within the method. And all I do is simply using the context to return my families. And of course, I do have to include the children, I have to include the gifts of the children, and I do have to include the address of the family. Well, okay, this method is all complete, but I still haven't hooked up the query to GraphQL. Well, let's do that now before we start testing our first iteration. And to be able to hook the query to the middleware, of course, we have to be in the middleware, and just below my registration of the pooled DB context factory, I will add some code that will actually say, well, to the services collection, I want to add GraphQL server support. I will add the query type for family. And since family query does use my DB context, because I started using it within the method, I do have to register the DB context as a gift context. And because I put it here as a pooled DB context factory, I do have to add the argument DB context kind pooled to it. And I did copy a bit too much, so simply put a semicolon behind it, and this would be enough. But of course we also need to use my GraphQL to make sure that the GraphQL endpoint is reachable. Okay, and this should be enough to start debugging and running our first version of the service. So let's hit the debug button. The code gets compiled, the service starts, and we do get information about the Christmas gift service. Let's rescale that a bit so that you can actually see it good enough. And okay, that's good enough. And what we will see is that the Swagger endpoint is displayed. Well, I'm not interested in the Swagger endpoint. I'm interested in my GraphQL endpoint, and I can reach that simply by entering GraphQL. And when we start it, you will see the banana cake pop up, and that's our test bed to use for our GraphQL query. So I'm going to browse the schema. It's going to load the schema. So what you will see is that our method getAllChildren, the get gets cut off, and it got a method called allChildren, which contains a list of families. Well, let's first start our first query, and our first query contains to all children. And what do I want to get from our own children? It's a family, a collection of families that we do. Well, I'm interested in the name of the family, of course, and I'm interested in the children, and for every child I'm interested in the name of the child, but I'm also interested in the gifts the child wants to receive. And I do know that a gift has a name, that a gift has a description, and of course family has an address, and that address has a street name, it resides in a city, and it does have a house number. Well, this is the way that you actually specify a query in GraphQL, where you can specify the things that you want to get fetched from the service. If I run now this service, it should return a response. Well, if you look back at our code that we generated in our GraphQL in the gift context, there were two actually families. There's the family Smith with John and Jane as a child, and John would like to have a doll, and Jane would like to have a game, but also a book, and a scary one. And the second family, called Jansen, a typical Dutch name, with two children with typical Dutch names like Piet and Sandra, and they would like to have a bicycle and a book. And if you look at what got generated, you will see that those information for the Smith family, we've got John that wants a doll, and we've got Jane that wants a game and a book. And they live at New York at Avenue 5000. And the family name of Johnson has two children, Piet and Sandra. And Piet would like a bicycle, and preferably a fast one. And Sandra would like a book for a real-time novel. And they live at my local city at Tilburg. So that's the way that you can start using the query. But if you look at the code, there's one big downside to this, and that revolves all around the inclusion of all the dependent properties. And if you look at the information, you will see that in this pane you will see what gets queried to the database. But if I change the query, and for instance, if I say, well, I'm not even interested in the address part of our family, and I run the query again, and if I look at the pane, you will still see that the address got joined in. So I do overfetch the information in my database for the query that I just asked. So we're going to change this. Fortunately, it's quite easy to change this behavior. I will show you. Well, simply I'm going to add a different method, returning iQueryable from family, and I do name the method a bit differently, projected. And all I do now is simply return the context of the families. But I also do something else. I add a attribute useProjection on top of this. Okay, but if I want to use this, I'm not only having to specify this attribute, I have to change something in the registration as well. So I do have to add to here is add projections. And let's see what happens, because that's the only thing that I did. Add a new method, return iQueryable, and add an attribute, use projections, and add projections here. And if we now start debugging this service, you can see a quite different behavior. And just wait until it starts again. I do have to get back to the GraphQL endpoint. And of course, it's still here. If I run this query, this is the old one. But if I run this query, and you can see that the method got added to the schema as well. If I now use addChildrenProjected and I run this query, you will see the same information being returned. But if I look at the query being fired to my database, you will see that no address information is being retrieved. So simply adding projections will limit the overfetching of data. And because we do have or want to write a high scalability service, preventing overfetching is a very important aspect for using GraphQL. Well, with this in place, Santa can fetch at least all the gifts children want, but it would be not very useful because he needs to fetch all the families at once. So you would like to get some way to start filtering the data being retrieved. Well, fortunately, that's easy to do because we can actually add use filtering as an attribute. And also on the program CS, after add projections, we can also add filtering here. And what will happen now, it will allow us to specify what we want to fetch from the database using simply a GraphQL query language. So if we now run this query, and you have to remember that our first family was called Smith. So let's go to my GraphQL endpoint. And if I run this one, just to fetch your memory, Smith is retrieved, but also Janssen is retrieved. So can I simply change this? Well, yes, because I added the filtering option, you will see that there's a ID here. So I now have a where clause where I can specify name, and it's a bit of a weird syntax, but you will get used to it. And we simply will put in Smith here as the equals. And if we now run this query, and I didn't make any mistakes, you will see that only the Smith family gets returned. So this will allow Santa simply to retrieve the children from a certain family. And if you look at Rider, and you look at the query being fired against the database, you will also see that that information is used within the query so that overfetching isn't done from the database. So what you actually see returned is the thing that got returned from the database, and there's no filtering being done at the client side to limit the records that you see. So a very powerful way to simply change the way you can get data. So for Santa we have the entire solution in place. He can fetch information of the children, the gifts they want, and based on the family, but it wouldn't be very nice for the children because they have no way to add requests for gifts to Santa. Well, let's add that as well. And you should consider that change in the database, a change in the resource, for GraphQL, it will mean that it's always a mutation. So that's the thing that we have to create. So we do have to create within our GraphQL schema, we have to create a family mutation. And that family mutation will have a certain prototype, because what I will say is I do want it to named add gift. I do want the gift context to be injected. But you also see here some different classes, add gift request and add gift payload, because I do want to specify what information I want to retrieve from the query, want to get from the query, from the mutation, to store in the database, but also I want to return a payload in order for the client to know what is happening. Well, let's see. If I start adding the add gift request, let's start doing that. I simply say add gift request, and what will be part of the add gift request? Well, I just came up with this. You do need a family name, I do need a child name, I do need the gift name and the gift description. And of course for the payload, there's not a whole lot that I want to retrieve, but so I create the add gift payload, and within that payload I simply want to return a string if there's an error or not. Great. So if I go back to family mutation, the types are now supported. But what I of course now need to do is write information about how that mutation is actually handled. Well, this goes far beyond the things that I want to talk to you about, but of course I do have a working solution. And what I do is simply I look up the family that's within the request, and if the family is not found yet, I'll simply create a new family, and you will see that I don't have an address for the family because I didn't put it in the request. And I simply look up the child, and otherwise I can always add a new child. And simply add the gifts to the child. I don't do a check if the gift has already been requested by the child. This is merely to keep things simple. I save the changes and I add the gift to the payload. Great. So I have a mutation in place, but just like the way that I had to add the query type, I also have to add the mutation type. So after this one, I simply put an enter, and I will say add mutation type. And I want to add the mutation type family mutation, but because, and that's why you saw me copying code just a second ago, because I also inject the DB context, I also have to add the register DB context here again, so that it will work for the mutation type. If you forget to do that, mutation type won't work. Okay, that's it. I've created a mutation, I've added a request, I've added a payload, I've added some code to it. Let's see if we can actually get this running. So I hit the run button, the debug button, I let the browser start up again, and it will simply put up, I'll refresh the schema so that I know that there's a mutation, and I can always check that in the schema reference, because then you will see there's a family mutation. Well, great. How can we use it? Well, let's simply say that I do need a mutation, and that's simply a way to tell it. Use the curly brackets. I do have an add gift, and within that gift I do have a request class, and within that request class I do have properties to fill. I can use the family name. Well, let's reuse our Janssen, our Dutch family, and we did have a child named Sandra, and if I'm correct, and Sandra would like to, let's see, oh, of course, don't have to use it. Equal sign, have to use a colon, and she would like to get a gift, and even Sandra would like to have a book, but there's a description for it, not too scary. Okay, simply see, did I miss any quotes? Gift description. There's, oh, did it again. Simply put in the semicolon. Bit too comfortable with writing C# code. And okay, let's see, that gift does return information. So after this gift, I will simply say, what do I want to be returned? I do want the error to be displayed. Okay, great. And if I now run this query, you will see there is an error of none, so that the gift has been added to the child. And simply to make sure that that's true, simply change this one into Janssen and ask the data again, and there you will see our book, Not Too Scary, for Sandra. Okay, so with an easy setup for mutations and writing some custom code, you can actually start supporting adding resources with a GraphQL service as well. Well, Santa can be pleased because in the last few minutes we created a service for him that allows him to fetch the gifts requested by children, and the children can be happy because they have an ability, a possibility to add requests for gifts to Santa. Well, that's about it.